Hi, I'm Dave Epstein. Welcome to this edition of Growing Wisdom. I'm talking today about dahlias, pulling them up, storing them for winter. That time of the year where we are digging up the dahlia tubers, what I do is I wait till I get a frost. So I've had a frost. You can see that the plants died back, no longer flowering. Now, I've planted the dahlias underneath this pine here. The sun hit them. They were blooming beautifully all summer long. We have some ajuga here. Some of the smaller ones, I like to kind of go in and sort of feel where the tubers are before I dig, because I sometimes end up damaging the tuber, which then you don't want to store it because it can rot. So there it is there. And you can see beautiful, nicely, all nice and clumped. And then what I do is I actually take the shovel and get underneath. I fully realize the way I'm doing it may not be the way you do it, but what I like to do is get right underneath, away from where the tubers are, and lift. And that way, I'm not damaging them. I find digging forks, I pierce them. And that's just me. So I go further away. That's why I sort of saw where the clump was. I go in the back and get underneath and lift it. And now I have all the tubers like this. And generally, they're okay. Now what I'll do is I'll let this dry out in the garage for a couple of days or in the basement. And then I'm going to store this. And I store them in peat moss. That's how I store them. And I'll also cut back. I generally cut them back to about here. And the reason I do that is because I just like to see the tops. You can cut it back. You know, you don't need any of this really, but I leave like about that much. If your soil is really loose, you can just, I started doing this, pull these up and they'll just come up. It just depends on your soil. If it's in a container, maybe you can just yank them out. You know, if you wait till you get your first frost, I find they're a little easier because the roots have started to die back a little bit. But that's a beautiful clump. I label these, so this is a red and white one. I'll just label it. Occasionally in the digging process, I will pierce one. You can see there, I've sliced it. And you don't want to store this because it's open. So what I do is I just gently twist it off. Again, you could cut it with a pair of Felcos as well and give it a nice slice, but I don't have my Felcos in my hand. So I just twist that off. And then these other tubers will be fine. Now, you could throw this away, or you could store this by itself, let it dry, let this callus over, and let that dry. And you might be able to plant that, you know, with this calloused over. It might grow if you need it, if you're, you know, limited on what you have. But I would not put this in with those because of the wetness. It can cause some disease, so we'll put that one separately. These are the dahlias I'm going to try to save for the winter. I put them in this metal container. I then just cover it with peat moss. It works for me. Some people use bulb crates. Some people use plastic bags. Some people wash their dahlias. Some people don't. Try whatever works for you. For me, this has worked well. I do check them in a couple of months just to be sure they haven't completely dried out. I even have sprinkled them with a little bit of moisture. If I find they're starting to dry out. If they do dry out, they're not going to be viable next spring. And then they'll go down in the basement over there. So that's where I store them, in an unheated basement in the dark, just like this. And I'll have enough. It's just me. I'm not a farm. I'm not trying to grow them for anything other than my own pleasure. So if some die, they die. If some don't make it, they don't make it. But that's quite a bit. I'll have enough to really get a nice crop next year. Now, that is my particular method for storing dahlias over the course of the winter. Other folks use other means. I was with a friend of mine who was actually taking her dahlias out and leaving the soil on there and just putting them in bags, and that's all she's going to do. I think it's really a little bit about personal preference, some experimenting. It also depends on how big the dahlia tubers are as well. But for me, what I showed you works pretty well, and I found that successive years, the dahlias do come back very nicely. For Growing Wisdom, I'm Dave Epstein.